Can you believe that cars used to come with features that were basically traps waiting to spring on you? We're not talking about small things. We are talking about steering wheels that could literally spear a driver. Today, we're going to look at 20 of these crazy old car features that would be totally illegal now. You will not believe what they put in place of a normal steering wheel in one car. 1. Solid metal dashboards. One of the most shocking things you would notice if you sat in a car from the 1950s or 1960s is the dashboard. You see, today our dashboards are made of soft plastics and foam. They are designed to cushion you in an accident. But back then, dashboards were just beautiful, painted slabs of solid steel. They looked amazing, with shiny chrome details and cool-looking dials, but they were incredibly dangerous. In a front-end collision, there was nothing to soften the blow. If you were a passenger in the front seat, your head could hit this solid metal wall with incredible force. It was one of the biggest causes of major injuries in car crashes for a very long time. There was no give, no crumple, just a hard stop. It is a scary thought. Car makers eventually realized that making the inside of the car as hard as the outside was a terrible idea. They started adding padding in the late 60s. And of course, today we have airbags that pop out of the dashboard to protect us. It's a huge change that has saved countless lives. While a metal dashboard was a big problem for the passenger, the driver had something even more dangerous pointed right at them. 2. Non-collapsible steering columns. The steering wheel is what gives you control of the car, but for many years, it was also one of the most dangerous things inside it. The reason was the steering column. This is the long metal rod that connects the steering wheel in your hands to the wheels on the road. For decades, this column was one single solid piece of steel. It was strong and simple, but in a crash, it was like a spear aimed right at the driver's chest. Here is what people did not realize for a long time. When you hit something head-on, the whole front of the car gets pushed backward. With a solid steering column, that meant the steering wheel was shoved back with enormous power, right toward the driver. This led to horrific injuries that could have been prevented. Finally, in the late 1960s, the government stepped in and made a new rule. All cars had to have collapsible steering columns. These new columns were designed to fold up like an accordion in a crash, absorbing the energy instead of sending it into the driver. It was a huge step forward for safety. Even with a safer steering column, engineers were still trying some truly weird and dangerous things with the steering wheel itself. 3. The wrist twist swivel system. Imagine getting into a car and instead of a big round steering wheel, you find two small plastic dials. That was the idea behind a strange experiment called the wrist twist swivel system. Back in the 1960s, a car company thought that getting rid of the steering wheel would make the car feel more futuristic, like a spaceship. The driver would place their hands on these two small rings and turn them to steer the car. One was for big turns and the other was for small adjustments. The problem was, it was incredibly confusing. People are used to a steering wheel. It gives you a feel for the road and lets you know where your wheels are pointing. These little dials gave no feedback at all. It was hard to control the car, and in an emergency, it would be almost impossible to make a quick turn. What people don't notice is that it was also a safety nightmare. A normal steering wheel gives you something to brace against, and its big padded rim offers some protection. With the wrist twist system, there was nothing between the driver and the hard metal dashboard. It was a crazy idea that luckily never made it into most cars. This was not the only strange idea for a steering wheel. Another one tried to solve a different problem but created a new danger. 4. Swing-away steering wheels. Getting in and out of the driver's seat used to be a little trickier, especially in big cars with wide bench seats. To make it easier, some car makers in the 1960s came up with the swing-away steering wheel. When you put the car in park, you could literally swing the entire steering wheel assembly to the side, opening up a clear path to get out. It seemed like a clever and convenient idea at first. But the thing is, adding a big hinge to something as important as your steering system is a risky move. These swing-away wheels had problems. Sometimes the locking mechanism would get weak over time. People worried that it could accidentally come unlocked while they were driving, which would be a total disaster. You could be going down the highway and suddenly your steering wheel is loose. It was also just another complicated part that could break. While it was a neat trick, the potential for failure was just too high. Car designers eventually figured out that it was better to just make the car doors open wider instead of messing with the steering. Engineers were not just experimenting with how to control the car, they were also trying out some very strange ideas for how to keep you safe in a crash. 5. Neck seat belts. This one is really hard to believe, but it is true. At one point, safety engineers were so worried about whiplash, which is when your head snaps back and forth in a crash, that they came up with a wild idea. They designed an experimental seatbelt that went around your neck. The thought was that if they could hold your head still, they could prevent neck injuries. They actually built and tested this idea. One of the most shocking aspects of this is how obviously dangerous it was. A sudden stop in a car puts tremendous force on your body. If all of that force was concentrated on your neck by a single strap, the results would be terrible. Instead of preventing injury, it would almost certainly cause a much more serious one. Thankfully, this was an idea that never ever made it into a production car. The engineers quickly realized that this was a path they should not go down. It is a perfect example of how sometimes, in the search for a solution, you can create a much bigger problem. It goes to show how little they understood about crash safety back then. Another example is one of the very first types of seatbelts that actually did make it into cars. 6. Lap-only seatbelts. Before the 3-point seatbelt we all use today became standard, the most common type of seatbelt was just a simple lap belt. It was a single strap that went across your waist, kind of like the seatbelt on an airplane. For a long time, people thought this was enough. It was definitely better than nothing because it kept you from flying out of your seat in a crash. That was a huge step forward for safety. But there was a massive flaw. A lap belt does nothing to hold your upper body in place. In a head-on collision, your legs and hips would be held down, but your torso and head would whip forward with incredible force. This meant drivers would slam into the steering wheel and passengers would hit that solid metal dashboard we talked about earlier. People were getting serious injuries to their head, neck, and chest, even while wearing their seatbelt. It took a while, but car makers finally understood that you need to secure the whole body. The invention of the shoulder strap, creating the 3-point system, was one of the most important safety improvements ever. Even with better seatbelts, the car's body itself was still a major source of danger. The way they built the frames was completely backward from how we do it today. 7. Absence of crumple zones. If you look at an old car from the 1950s, it looks like a tank. It is made of thick, heavy steel, and people used to think that this made them safer. The common belief was that a stronger, more rigid car would protect you better in a crash. Nobody can believe when it happened, but the truth was the exact opposite. These super strong car bodies were actually a huge danger to the people inside. Here is why. When a car crashes, there is a huge amount of energy. If the car's frame is completely rigid and does not bend or crumple, all of that energy gets transferred directly to the people inside. It is like being inside a steel box that suddenly comes to a violent stop. Your body keeps moving forward and slams into the inside of the car. It took a long time for scientists and engineers to figure this out. They eventually developed something called the crumple zone. Modern cars are designed to have the front and back ends crush and fold in a very specific way during a crash. This absorbs the energy of the impact, making the crash much softer for the people in the passenger cabin. It is a case where being weaker actually makes you safer. Another part of the car that was surprisingly weak and poorly placed was the fuel tank, leading to one of the biggest safety scandals in car history. 8. Unsafe fuel tanks. For a car to run, it needs to carry around a tank full of gasoline, which is a very flammable liquid. You would think that keeping this tank safe would be a top priority, but for a long time, the placement of the fuel tank was not given much thought. Some cars had them in the front, some on the side, and some in the back. One of the most famous examples of a bad design was the Ford Pinto from the 1970s. The Pinto was a small, cheap car, and to save space and money, its fuel tank was placed at the very back of the car, behind the rear axle. What people don't notice is that this left it very exposed. If another car hit the Pinto from behind, even at a low speed, the impact could easily rupture the fuel tank. Worse yet, the bolts from the rear axle were pointed right at the tank and could puncture it like a can opener. This design led to a number of terrible accidents where cars would burst into flames after a simple fender bender. It became a huge scandal and forced the entire auto industry to rethink how and where they put fuel tanks. Today, they are much better protected and are usually placed in a safer location in front of the rear axle. The fuel tank was not the only explosive danger. Believe it or not, even the bumpers on some cars were designed to pop. 9. Water balloon bumpers. Bumpers are supposed to protect your car in a small collision. Today, they are complex systems designed to absorb impact. But in the 1970s, one company came up with a very strange and simple idea. They created bumpers that were basically just big, tough vinyl bags that you would fill with water. The idea was that the water would absorb the energy of a crash and then just splash out. It sounds a little silly, and it was. While they might have worked for a very slow speed bump, like backing into a pole at 1 or 2 miles per hour, they were useless in a real accident. In a moderate crash, the bag would just burst, and then you would have no protection at all. They also had other problems. The water could freeze in the winter, turning your bumper into a solid block of ice. And if they got a small leak, you would leave a trail of water wherever you went. It was a weird fad that did not last long, as people realized that a bag of water was not a great replacement for a solid piece of safety equipment. These water bumpers were trying to protect the car, but another part of the car was a huge danger to people outside the car. 10. Dangerous hood ornaments. For many decades, one of the coolest parts of a car was the hood ornament. It was a little statue, often made of sharp, pointy metal that sat on the front of the hood. You had the famous Rolls-Royce Spirit of Ecstasy, the sleek Jaguar on a Jaguar, and the Rocket on an Oldsmobile. These ornaments were a symbol of style and luxury. They made the car look special. But one of the most shocking things is that nobody seemed to think about what would happen if a car with one of these sharp ornaments hit a pedestrian. These beautiful little sculptures were basically spears. In an accident involving a person, the hood ornament was often the first point of contact, and it could cause terrible injuries. As safety became a bigger concern in the 1970s and 80s, governments and car makers realized this was a serious problem. New rules were created that required hood ornaments to be made of softer materials or to be designed to break away or retract in a collision. This is why you almost never see them on modern cars. The risk to pedestrians was just too great. The front of the car had other dangers too. Something as simple as the windshield could act in a very unexpected and unsafe way during a crash. 11. Pop-out windshields. The windshield is a critical piece of safety equipment. It holds the roof up in a rollover and keeps you from being thrown out of the car. But in the early days, some car designers had a very different idea. They thought that if the windshield could just pop out of its frame during a crash, it would be safer for the occupants. The theory was that you would not hit your head on the hard glass. This was a terrible idea for two big reasons. First, as we just mentioned, the windshield is part of the car's structure. If it pops out, the roof can collapse more easily in a rollover accident. The second and bigger problem is that it created an open hole for people to be ejected from the vehicle. Being thrown from a car is one of the most dangerous things that can happen in a crash. Staying inside the protective cage of the car is much safer. Thankfully, engineers figured this out pretty quickly. They developed stronger glues and mounting systems that keep the windshield firmly in place, where it belongs. It seems so obvious now that you want the windshield to stay put. But what about the other windows? Even they had features that we would consider unsafe today. 12. Vent windows. If you look at cars made before the 1980s, you will often see a small triangular piece of glass in the front doors. This was called a vent window or a wing window. It was on a hinge and you could open it with a little crank or latch to let in a small amount of fresh air without having to roll down the whole main window. It was a pretty clever feature before most cars had good air conditioning. So what was the problem? Truth be told, there were a couple of issues. The first was security. These little windows were a favorite target for car thieves. They were very easy to break quietly. or pry open, allowing someone to reach in and unlock the door. The other issue was safety. In a side impact crash, that extra piece of glass and metal frame created another hard point inside the car. The glass could also shatter in a way that was more dangerous than the main side windows, which are designed to break into small, dull pieces. As air conditioning became standard in almost all cars, the need for vent windows disappeared, and car makers were happy to get rid of them for both safety and security reasons. Speaking of side doors, the way some of them opened was so dangerous that they earned a terrifying nickname. 13. Rear-hinged doors. On almost every car today, the doors are hinged at the front. You pull the handle and the back edge of the door swings out. It is a simple, safe design, but for a while, some car companies tried putting the hinge at the back of the door. This meant the front edge of the door by the driver would swing out toward the front of the car. These became known by a scary name: suicide doors. They got this name for a very good reason. The thing is, if one of these doors was not latched perfectly and it came open while the car was moving, the wind would catch it like a sail. The rushing air would rip the door open with incredible force and could easily pull the person sitting next to it right out of the car. It was a terrifying thought. Even just trying to close a door that had flown open was extremely dangerous. As you can imagine, this design led to some horrible accidents. By the 1960s, they were pretty much gone from mainstream cars because of the obvious danger. The doors were not the only part of the car's side that was unsafe. Inside, the seating arrangement could also be a major problem. 14. Bench seats. For many decades, the front seat of most family cars was not two separate bucket seats like we have today. It was one long, continuous bench seat that went all the way across the car. This was great if you wanted to fit 3 people in the front, and it gave the car a roomy, open feeling, like a couch on wheels. Kids loved them because they could sit in the middle, right next to their parents. But from a safety point of view, bench seats were a disaster. First, the person in the middle had no real seatbelt. They usually just had a simple lap belt, and we already know how unsafe those are. Second, there was nothing to hold you in place during a turn. With modern bucket seats, the side bolsters keep you from sliding around. On a flat bench seat, a sharp turn could send passengers sliding across the car and into the door. Most importantly, bench seats did not offer good support for your body, and they were incompatible with modern safety features like side airbags, which are built into the sides of our seats today. As safety became more important, the bench seat quickly disappeared. While sitting in the middle of a bench seat was unsafe, another danger was right at the driver's feet. 15th floor mounted dimmer switches. Today, when you want to switch from your regular headlights to your high beams, you flick a stalk on the side of your steering column. It is simple, easy, and you never have to take your hands off the wheel, but it was not always that convenient. In older cars, the switch for the high beams was a small, round button on the floor to the left of the brake and gas pedals. To switch your lights, you had to stomp on it with your foot. This seems like a small thing, but what people don't notice is that it could be surprisingly distracting and dangerous. Your feet should be focused on the pedals that make the car go and stop. Having to move your foot over to find and press a small button in the dark could take your attention away from the road for a critical second. Also, these floor switches were exposed to all the dirt, salt, and water that came into the car on your shoes. They would often get rusty and stuck, either refusing to turn the high beams on or refusing to turn them off, which is dangerous for other drivers. Moving the switch up to the steering column was a simple change that made driving just a little bit safer. Another feature that was supposed to make driving more comfortable actually created a different kind of injury risk. 16. Lack of headrests. It is hard to imagine a car seat today without a headrest. They are so common that we do not even think about them. But if you look at cars from before the late 1960s, you will see that most of them had low-back seats with no headrests at all. At the time, they were seen as a luxury item, not a piece of safety equipment. This was a huge mistake. One of the most common injuries in a car accident, especially when you are hit from behind, is whiplash. This happens when the impact throws your body forward, but your head, having nothing to stop it, snaps violently backward over the top of the seat. Then it whips forward again. This can cause serious and painful damage to your neck. A properly positioned headrest, also called a head restraint, is designed to catch your head and prevent it from snapping back so far. When safety experts realized how many neck injuries were happening, the government made headrest mandatory in 1969. It was a simple addition that has prevented an incredible amount of pain and injury over the years. Even with headrest, the act of just stopping the car used to be much more of a gamble than it is today. 17. No anti-lock brakes, ABS. We take it for granted that when we slam on the brakes in an emergency, the car will stop in a straight line. But for most of automotive history, that was not the case at all. Before the invention of anti-lock brakes, or ABS, a panic stop was a very scary event. If you pushed the brake pedal too hard, the wheels would lock up. This means they would stop spinning completely, and the tires would just skid along the pavement. When your wheels are skidding, you have no steering control. The car will just continue in whatever direction it was going, and you cannot steer around the obstacle you are trying to avoid. It is a terrifying feeling of being completely out of control. To stop safely in an old car, you had to learn how to pump the brakes, which meant quickly pressing and releasing the pedal to keep the wheels from locking. It was a skill that not everyone had, especially in a moment of panic. ABS was a revolutionary invention. It is a computer system that does the pumping for you thousands of times per second, allowing you to both brake as hard as possible and still steer the car. It is now required on all new cars for a very good reason. Braking was not the only thing that was less reliable. Even the bumpers designed for low-speed impacts had a critical flaw. 18. Giant chrome and steel bumpers. Before the water bumpers, and long before our modern plastic-covered bumpers, cars were adorned with massive, heavy bumpers made of solid steel and covered in shiny chrome. They looked fantastic and were incredibly strong. If you got into a tiny fender bender with another car from that era, you might just have a small dent in your giant bumper. People thought this meant the cars were tougher and safer, but this was the same mistake they made with rigid car frames. These bumpers did not absorb any energy. In a crash, they simply transferred all of the force right through the car's frame and into the people inside. They did a great job of protecting the car's sheet metal, but they did a terrible job of protecting the passengers. There was also another big problem. What people don't notice is how dangerous these were for pedestrians. Being hit by a car with a soft, modern bumper is bad enough. Being hit by a car with a solid steel girder on the front was much, much worse. Modern bumpers are designed to be safer for everyone, inside and outside the car. The bumpers were just one dangerous design element. A far more common feature, one that was in almost every car for decades, created both a distraction and a fire hazard. 19. Cigarette lighters and ashtrays. For a huge part of the 20th century, smoking was incredibly common, and cars reflected that. Almost every single car came standard with a cigarette lighter and at least one ashtray, usually more. The lighter was a little metal coil that would heat up until it was glowing red hot. You would then use it to light your cigarette while driving. Today, it is easy to see the problems with this. First, taking your eyes off the road to find and use a glowing hot piece of metal is a major distraction. Fumbling with a cigarette, a lighter, and an ashtray while trying to steer a car is not a recipe for safety. Second, it was a fire hazard. People could easily drop a lit cigarette, or the lighter itself, onto the car's flammable carpet or seats. As smoking became less popular and the dangers of distracted driving became more clear, car companies started phasing them out. What used to be the cigarette lighter is now a 12-volt power outlet that we use to charge our phones, a much safer use for that little round hole in the dashboard. The distractions did not end there. Even the way you opened your windows could be a real problem. 20. Manual window cranks. Power windows are standard on just about every new car sold today. You press a button and the window goes up or down, but for most of car history, you had a manual crank. It was a little handle that you had to turn round and round to raise and lower the window glass. It was simple and it worked, but it had some hidden dangers. One of the most shocking aspects was the distraction it caused for the driver. Imagine you are driving on the highway and need to ask for directions or pay a toll. You would have to take one hand off the wheel and lean all the way across the passenger seat to crank down that window. It was awkward and it took your focus off of driving. There was also a safety risk for children. A child could get their head or arm stuck in a closing window, and a manual crank could make it difficult to reverse it quickly. Power windows with auto-reverse safety features have made cars much safer for everyone, especially for kids in the back seat. It is one more small change that has made a big difference in our daily driving lives.